This strip of plywood is about the same thickness as a pen, but I took one sheet of this exact plywood and built the table that I'm sitting in the middle of right now. Imagine you've got a pile of stuff sitting in the corner of your basement, but you want to use that space as a workbench. All you got to do is take the top third, move it to the ceiling, and then add something that'll hold it there. Unfortunately, instead of just buying a heavy-duty shelf from Home Depot, I decided to make this structure using one sheet of plywood that had a thickness somewhere between a McDonald's straw and a boba straw. Why? Well, for one thing, I got the wood for free, and secondly, because my brain told me it was an engineering challenge. To understand how this surface is able to hold my weight in the middle of it, let's start by simplifying this whole structure to just a big weight sitting in the middle of a 2D beam. As the weight pushes down in the middle, it causes the beam to feel two different forces. On the top, the material is being squished together or compressed, and at the same time, on the bottom, the material is being pulled apart. If we zoom in on this area, we find something kind of interesting. The amount that any little bit of material is being squished or stretched apart is based on how far it is from the center of the beam. At the top, it's being squished a lot, and then it gets less and less squished until we get to the middle, where it's not squished at all. And then if you go a little further down, it starts being pulled apart and more pulled apart all the way to the bottom where it's the most stretched apart. But what does this mean for my table here? You might look at that last clip, and for a split second, you might think, well, if there's less squishing and stretching near the center of the beam, then maybe we should just make the beam thinner. But wait, that doesn't make any sense. In the real world, we know that a thicker beam is generally stronger than a thinner beam. So let's try thinking about this a different way. You can try this yourself. If you take a book and hold it upright on the corner, overhanging the edge of a table, you can pretty easily balance the book if you keep the bottom corner from sliding out, and if you hold the top edge with your other hand. You can think of this like an L-shaped lever where the corner is the pivot point. The weight of the book is pulling down, trying to turn the book this way. But my top hand is pulling sideways, trying to turn the book this way. Now, if we try to grip it further down, it becomes harder and harder to hold the book upright. And eventually, right above the pivot point, it becomes nearly impossible to actually hold the book up. Okay, now imagine I challenge you to hold this book up, but instead of using your hands, you're only allowed to use a single thin strip of tape. Where on the book would you attach the tape to? At the bottom, near the pivot point, or maybe further up the book? Well, if we try it, near the bottom, the tape breaks because the turning force of the book is pulling too hard on the tape. But if we move the tape up further, the amount that the book pulls on the tape decreases, and at some point the tape can hold the book up. Now what happens if I add this extra weight here, effectively doubling how much the book weighs? Well, now there's twice as much force turning the book this way, and to fight against that, you could do one of two things. Firstly, you could add a second piece of tape in the exact same position. It makes sense that double the tape can hold double the weight. Kind of seems like cheating, but we'll get back to that later. The second thing you could do is keep moving the tape further up the edge of the book. How much further? Well, it turns out to hold double the weight, you can also double the distance from the pivot point. You probably already recognize this as a simple example of leverage. The longer the lever arm, the easier it is to apply more turning force. So let's take this a tiny step further. What if instead of one extra weight, we added 5 extra weights, such that the book is effectively 6 times heavier than it started as? Just like in the previous case, we could take the easy route and just use 6 strips of tape. Or we could use science and attach one piece of tape 6 times further from the pivot point. Seems like moving the tape higher would save us a whole bunch of tape, but unfortunately this book isn't physically that tall. So does that mean we have to use 6 strips of tape here? Well, not necessarily. If we think back to the previous setup, we know that one strip of tape here held as much as 2 strips of tape attached here. So we can literally replace 2 of these strips here with 1 strip here. So now we have 4 at this lower position and 1 at this middle position. Now we can make that trade again, but we could also follow the pattern further, and instead of exchanging 2 pieces of tape, we could exchange 3 pieces of tape for 1 strip 3 times higher from the pivot point. This way we can hold the same amount of weight while only using 3 pieces of tape. Just by making these simple trades, you can see that there's many combinations that can all physically support the same amount of weight. Now you might be wondering, what does this tape example have to do with anything? Well, when we're trying to design beams to support things like bridges or floors or even tables, we actually come across the same kind of force, but just sometimes turned upside down. Now the pivot point from before is actually in the middle of the table, and the force that was pulling the edge of the book down is now pulling upwards. Where does that upward force come from? Well, if you press down in the middle of any table, why doesn't the tabletop start moving down? Well, actually it should, but it doesn't because the legs on the edge of the table are pushing up on the tabletop with as much force as you're pushing down on it. In other words, the twisting force here on the left side of the table is equivalent to the turning force we saw in the book. Going back to the tape, we can actually think of each strip of tape representing a tiny strip of wood inside the beam. It would make sense then that moving the tape further from the pivot represents making the beam taller. But what does stacking more tape look like for a real beam? It's actually almost the same. You can just stack more material at the same distance from the pivot point. So now if I asked you to make this beam hold more weight, you would know to just add more material and you try to add it as far from the pivot point as possible. If you're trying to save material, you might even think to take some of the material from the center of the beam and move it closer to the edge. But remember, there's no book holding the strips in position anymore. The strips themselves are holding each other in position. So we do need some material between the pivot point and the outer edge to actually hold the strips in place. Lastly, if we take all this science about the material being pulled apart, we can apply a similar strategy to the top half where it's being squished together or compressed. And from that, we get this: the heart of modern construction, the backbone of the bridges interconnecting our world, the pillars of today's skylines, and the very essence of how we create. Hey, did you use an AI to generate this? Anyways, I didn't actually use any I-beams on this table. I just think they're kind of cool. So let's cut to the build montage. So, if I-beams are so cool, why didn't I use them for this table? Well, here's the thing. When we're working with thin strips of wood particularly, you can actually pull really hard on a strip before it breaks. On the other hand, if I try to compress the strip, it will start to bend like this, way before it actually breaks. In engineering, this bending is called buckling. And it doesn't just apply to beams that are only being compressed. You can take a strip of paper and try this for yourself. If you try to bend it this way, you'll notice that before anything breaks, this top edge here will buckle or bend out in this direction. So how do we prevent this buckling? Well, we do the same thing we did before. We stack more material to thicken the section that is bending, and that gives us a T-beam. If you look at a lot of large overpasses, you'll see that the road itself forms part of a massive T-beam. And on a smaller scale, if you stick a whole bunch of these T-beams side by side, you get this table. In other words, I didn't use an I-beam because the bottom of these vertical beams didn't need the bottom of the I to be strong enough, and the top of the vertical beams were supported by the material of the tabletop itself, basically making it a pseudo T-beam. How did I decide how big to make the T-beams and how far to space them apart? Well, I just ran the numbers through this fancy equation, and then I added a couple triangle beams because triangles are strong and triangles are the bestigons.
What?
To finish things off, I just photoshopped this random back leg out of the thumbnail and painted the front edge black, because why not?
And that's the completed workbench. I did glue a thin sheet of particle board on the top surface just so that I could use the surface without getting splinters, but I'm pretty sure it doesn't add anything to the mechanical structure of the table. This is what the build looks like after loading it up with a couple boxes. And in theory, I should be able to do this.